All right. Our next speaker is Sasha Stortz. She specializes in collaborative planning and designing spatial decision support systems for land management in the Southwest. A research associate with Northern Arizona University's Landscape Conservative Initiative, Sasha leads the LCI's collaborative planning program. Sasha holds a BA in biology from Lewis and Clark College and an MS in environmental sciences and policy from Northern Arizona University.
Great, thank you. Oops. Uh-oh. Did I do something? I moved it.
There we go.
All right. Here we are. So thank you for having me, Megan and Mark and the whole planning committee. I first off wanted to acknowledge some colleagues that I've been working on these ideas with, primarily Colin Haffey, Carrie Kimball, and Jeremy Sweat on some work in New Mexico, and Claire Aslan, Dave Theobald, and Leah Sandberg in the Sonoran Desert. And so these ideas are all about a lot of people's work together. So what I want to talk about today is how we think about restoration and multiple use in the context of large-scale landscape change. Now, what do I mean by landscape change? What are we talking about there? Yesterday, we got to see Mark Brenson's wonderful interpretive dance of this idea. But when I'm talking about landscape change, I'm really talking about the shifts and transformations that might occur when a system crosses a threshold due to some kind of perturbation or disturbance and winds up in a new state. And one of the main ways that I'll talk about that today is the combination of fire regime shifts and climate change resulting in forest fires of high enough intensity and sometimes repeat fires that shift from a forested area to an oak or a shrubland or grassland. And moving to the Sonoran Desert, another situation that we see is a situation where climate and introduced species that are fire adapted has really led to fire events in a system that is not fire adapted. And we now see a probable new pattern of severe fire at intervals driven by weather with a positive feedback loop that leads to more invasive species that like fire. So, these are two ways of looking at ecosystem transition, and complicating these ideas are the fact that we don't always understand when a threshold has been crossed, how permanent that change may be. But in these systems, researchers generally acknowledge changes on the order of magnitude from decades to centuries. And at a minimum, we can think that these changes are occurring beyond the lifetime at which we are usually doing public land management planning. So they might require some thinking and some planning in and of themselves. So we have this question then, how should we respond when an ecosystem crosses a threshold? And this is an interesting place to be. When we think about restoration, we often think about removing the invasive species or restoring the forest structure. But after an ecosystem transition, is it too late? And the question is is it too late for what? Management response in these altered areas may often be to do nothing by default. The bad thing already happened there. But doing nothing might be the most appropriate response, but there can be the opportunity for an intentional thought process to get to that decision. And I'd also argue that a really important part of the decision about what to do in these transformed areas is what the social context is and what stakeholders really would like to see for this landscape in the future. What are the essential uses and valued attributes of the landscape that they would like to see restored or maintained? So we're already seeing more dramatic shifts to landscapes, and I'd argue it's worth being intentional about what we do in response. It can be really complicated to talk about landscape restoration in areas that have already undergone this type of type conversion because there are so many resources needed in areas that haven't passed that turning point. We're in a time of scarce resources, and we may think about triaging, and many would think that the places that are in most need of the restoration attention is the forest that hasn't turned into this type of a landscape yet. But when forest restoration, for example, is sometimes outpaced or outscaled by fires outside of that historic range of variability, and sometimes a new state like shrubland might actually be more resilient to future climatic conditions, I'd argue that addressing management and land use, both pre and post-disturbance, are really two sides of the same coin and something we need to be thinking about. And in addition, can be this major kind of social and emotional role to addressing landscape change. When I talk to people in the East Jemez here, and they talk about the magical places they experienced that they had growing up, places they can't bring themselves to go back to or don't exist anymore. They talk about the way a community was split apart or rallied together after a disturbance event. Sometimes they talk about the new sense of wonder that they have looking at a newly opened landscape. And so it becomes clear that the uses and the relationship to place has really changed, and that's an important part of the conversation as well. So I want to start by sharing some work, a small story that's just a piece of a larger project in the Sonoran Desert, work that's been funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. This project encompasses the Sonoran Desert ecoregion, which includes tribal lands, military lands, BLM, park, Forest Service, municipal lands, and wildlife refuge. In this area, we have had the context is a series of precipitation events and biomass bursts that have led to unprecedented fire ignitions. And in 2005, those fires encompassed about 89% of the total burned area over a 2-decade period in that region. And to researchers, this has really indicated a probable new fire regime in the Sonoran with severe fires at intervals that's really driven by weather with a positive feedback loop in which fire-loving introduced species are reinforced in these fire events, and we move away from non-fire adapted plants. This project involves a lot of fire mapping, modeling of resilience, and broadly we're looking at the relationship between vegetation, fire regime shifts, and management in this area, and how they all really influence each other. We're also looking at what happens when systems reach adaptation turning points, the point at which current land uses and management no longer meet existing management objectives and a change in strategy might be necessary. And we're looking at this in a spatial way. And I just wanted to highlight some results from a survey that we did that asked about barriers to changing management strategies in the face of this fire regime shift. And I look at this list and I think, oh, hello, old friends. These are familiar barriers: time, capacity, public opposition to change, cultural and organizational opposition to change, inadequate information to justify change. So in my mind, the good news is that the barriers that folks see on this landscape to changing in the face of an altered fire regime and altered vegetation, they're not really new challenges to go with the new fire regime. But on top of these types of familiar barriers, folks are finding themselves asking, but what is it that we do now? For land managers and others who live in these areas, ecosystem state change can be a unique challenge. Experience might not be sufficient to inform land management when ecosystem conditions are fundamentally new. And there's often a landscape component to these changes that can bring in an opportunity for co-management. Ecosystem transition doesn't see jurisdictional boundaries. At these large scales, neighbors' choices influence each other. If you remove invasive species from your land upstream, I might be more likely to do the same. If you're not and they keep getting reinvaded, I'm maybe not going to do that. And uncertainty, both scientific uncertainty and kind of social values uncertainty, is often high. And so this is a situation where sharing information and really coming together can be a way to reckon with ecosystem transformation more effectively. So I wanted to talk more in depth about what's happening in another system dealing with ecosystem transition that I'd say can provide a path forward for addressing a number of the barriers to changing management strategies and really demonstrates the potential of coming together across jurisdictions at the landscape scale to grapple with these kinds of changes. And that's in the eastern side of the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico. So I'm going to walk you through some of the changes that have happened over the past century that have brought this landscape to where it is today, from forested to an affected area of about 300,000 acres that has been dominated by shrubs and grasslands through a series of cumulative impacts and feedback loops and relationships between climate and vegetation and fire. And this story really starts in the 1890s when fire exclusion begins in northern New Mexico. Skipping forward, in the mid-1950s, a major drought occurs which kills ponderosa pine in the warmest and driest extent of the range of these mountains. And in 1977, we see the La Mesa fire, which burned 14,000 acres. In the 1980s, warm, wet conditions allow rapid fuels to grow. And then in 1995, the Dome fire burns 16,500 acres. Now, Dome is the first of 3 fires that researchers like Tom Swetnam and Craig Allen have determined were far outside of the historic range of variability in fire severity, and with effects that were likely unprecedented for the past 1,000 years. And as with the following fires that I'll talk about, Dome resulted in significant areas of tree mortality and a shift from those dry conifer forests to shrublands and grasslands. To top off this, in the 2000s, drought kills 95% of the mature pinyon pine on the eastern flanks of the Jemez Mountain. And this drought was accompanied by temperatures 1 degree Celsius hotter than any previously measured. And so it caused this massive mortality event. Following that, also in 2000, we had the Cerro Grande fire, getting bigger now, burning 47,650 acres, and it destroys 350 homes. And in 2011, the Las Conchas fire burns across the entire footprint of the 1996 Dome fire in one day, and 153,000 acres in all. Nearly 30% of this fire is at high severity, and it includes many areas that had previously burned. So Las Conchas really reinforces this transition from conifer forest to shrubland and grassland and high-severity burned areas by killing both conifer regeneration after the past fires and their adjacent seed sources. Here is a view of the same canyon, Upper Frijoles Canyon watershed, in 1997, and after Las Conchas in 2011. Just one fraction of the landscape. And fire season in the Southwest is followed by monsoons. So post-fire flooding really scours riparian areas, nearly all of which drain into the Rio Grande, and many of these areas have burned, including those cottonwood galleries. So this really contributes dramatically to increased post-fire runoff and sediment transport, and these disturbances had significant effects on downstream water users, including disruptions to water intake operations that affected both the cities of Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Los Alamos County, also in this area, lost the use of its municipal water reservoir for 16 years. And during a monsoonal storm in 2013, one canyon, Peralta Canyon, had such a severe flood that the sediment plugged the Rio Grande and flow was shifted up against a levee that threatened a nearby village. So we have kind of cumulative impacts from drought, high severity fire, and post-fire flooding. And here's that zoomed out in spatial form. So over the past 20 years, these major disturbances driven by warmer temperatures and lower precipitation have significantly impacted this area, which is roughly 300,000 acres in size. And it crosses multiple land management boundaries. This landscape includes multiple Pueblo communities, including Santa Clara Pueblo, San Ildefonso, Cochiti, and Jemez Pueblos, numerous federal agencies, land grant communities, Los Alamos County, Los Alamos National Labs, and these drain into the Rio Grande. And red shows the areas of greatest forest loss since the 1990s. So in the eastern Jemez Mountains, we're faced with vegetation changes, altered ecological function, and uncertainty really about when or how to best restore or mitigate or adapt to this really large-scale change. And in the words of one person that I spoke with, I interviewed about this situation, she said, "What do you do after the end of the world?" So the question really became, what should we do to manage the altered landscapes of the eastern Jemez? And the answer for the moment is a group called the East Jemez Landscape Futures. It's a network of community members, land managers, and researchers that seek to coordinate research and information sharing and management strategies that honor the past way this landscape looked while acknowledging the inevitability of the landscape change. And the goal is to support natural and human communities for generations to come. This effort was initiated by Bandelier National Monument, which lies in the center of that map I showed you. About 85% of the monument was impacted. And they wanted to know if others were open to the idea of working together to address this landscape change. And I was invited in by Bandelier with some of my colleagues to kind of assess the potential to address this large-scale change through a collaborative effort. So we conducted about 50 interviews across 23 organizations over 4 months to assess people's interest in collaborating and sharing information more as they grappled with what to do in these areas. You can see some of the variety of organizations that were included in that: NGOs, tribes, agencies at state and federal level, researchers. I'll summarize some of our findings. We really first just wanted to know, do people think we should be doing something on this landscape? And the majority opinion was really, we should act. Interviewees were consistently interested in increasing coordination, information sharing, and research across the East Jemez, and the majority thought that acting to somehow restore or mitigate in some of these drought, fire, and flood-affected areas was a legitimate idea. Their perspectives really boiled down to, it's worth trying, or we have a responsibility to plan and to manage in post-fire areas too, or the feeling that action is simply empowering and engaging in response to these big changes. For those who are less gung-ho about acting in these areas, it really came down to the idea that we should let nature take its course, or the feeling that we could act, but there are other higher priority areas. This was especially true for jurisdictions that still had forested areas. You know, when we see what happened over here, we need to keep restoring these trees. There was this lack of capacity to address both landscapes at some times. But there was a strong message across all of these perspectives that no matter what, we need to be learning from what we do and what we don't do. So what is it that we should be doing? We explored this idea as well. And one of the strong messages that I wanted to highlight is, I think, a really important idea when we think about multiple use in a climate change future. Something we heard really strongly in conversations with the Pueblos is that there were plants that are needed for ceremonies or for dances, and without them, they can't necessarily happen. In some cases, people were going to other mountain ranges to find these plants. So there was a strong message of focusing on traditional uses in restoration choices, bringing in important plants, and then from a community perspective, engaging youth in restoration and using it as a language learning opportunity, for example. In addition to that message, another thing we heard strongly were that there were sort of three landscape strata where we could be thinking about actions in these landscapes: canyon bottoms, refugia of trees, and those type converted areas. In canyon bottoms, there was some efforts going on. You can see these pictures of people using the natural materials around to alter the hydrology of these really eroded canyon bottoms. And so there was an interest in learning from what was being done to slow water and reduce erosion. There was this interesting idea of silver linings that came up, that in these floods, non-native species had been wiped out, and so there was actually a great opportunity to reintroduce native fish populations to these rivers. And there's also concern that burn or reburn in higher elevation areas could impact the downstream system, and so a necessity to work across borders. In refugia, these are places on the landscape that the fire basically went around. There are these ponderosa pine islands, essentially, and there's interest in restoring structure to those remaining stands, so if fire comes through, it might come through in a healthy way. And in identifying refugia for different vegetation types and treating those as seed sources for the landscape. Then we come to type-converted areas, those that have gone from forest to oak, shrub, and grass. And this was really an area with the highest level of uncertainty. How long will it be this way, and what will come back? And a strong idea that came to the surface was to address management issues with experiments and adaptive management here. Interestingly, there was a really varied perception of the new fire regime and the fire risk level, so this was an area where more science was needed. Some people see oak as a fire break, whereas others see it as a place that fire could really just come through again and burn very hot. There is some work going on already to replant trees. There was interest in learning from that and in trying to replant strategically to take advantage of microsite conditions and create some connectivity across the landscape. And there were a lot of mixed thoughts, but openness to the idea of assisted migration, either within genotypes or across species, seeing what kind of trees we could bring back to this landscape. Just wanted to share a couple of kind of illustrative quotes. Someone we interviewed said, "There's a reason to leave some areas alone in addition to conducting experiments in other areas. Have a baseline there. Learn from these control areas." And from more of an emotional perspective, someone reflected, "If we can't get pine back, can we make trees out of oak?" Thinking about zooming out here, someone said, land doesn't stop at our border. We need an ecosystem approach. And Most major canyons and watershed in this area run through multiple jurisdictions. So in order to address anything on this landscape in a coordinated way, it is going to require working across boundaries. And there was a real openness in large part to that idea. Someone said, if we come up with a positive, forward-looking project, even if it's not restoration, if we have something positive to work together, it'll give us a sense of purpose and hope. We were taken by surprise, but what things can we do to help other people learn from this place? And this is the window we have to act. And so, acting, they did. In May 2017, the needs assessment was complete, and this has built some momentum. One of the major barriers to working on this landscape that was identified at the needs assessment was capacity regarding both time and money. So we recommended that the first step in a collaborative be increasing capacity. And the partnership so far has really focused on developing grant proposals. So in the following year, over 15 grant proposals were submitted for monitoring and research and restoration efforts, and partners have received funding for everything from monitoring and research to stream restoration to watershed planning. There's been planning in place to do some beaver reintroduction and Rio Grande cutthroat trout reintroduction. And in May of this year, we brought people together for a field trip and workshop at Santa Clara Canyon, where the Pueblo has really poured energy and resources into trying to reduce erosion and restore hydrological function to the canyon. And there was a lot of learning that happened during that. Most people outside of the Santa Clara Forestry Department hadn't seen what was going on here before. So, and there were also a lot of conversations about how to move ahead, to have a formal watershed work group, to collaborate on a landscape restoration plan, to have a seed collecting strategy for conifer restoration, and to do both control and treatment comparisons across canyons as more work was potentially being done. And we've been exploring kind of more creative and community-centered, interactive ways of processing landscape change as well, and exploring people's hopes for the future. And that includes this art installation by Sean Scabland and Kathleen Brenner, which was installed in a historic fire lookout at Bandelier and really explored this idea of boundaries and borders, invisible and visible lines. We're also doing a community storytelling project that explores community members' experiences of landscape change and really catalogs people's hopes for the future of this landscape. So some of what we've learned so far kind of includes that people's capacity to, or their self-perceived capacity to adapt, seems to kind of build with a sense of purpose that's shared. There's really importance in this conversation for both social values and science. We need science to better understand what's happening on this landscape. We need social values in order to understand what might be restored. And that those barriers, like capacity, really have to be addressed up front. But kind of coming down to it, I'd say that landscape change can catalyze collaboration and co-management, and management objectives can change in spite of uncertainty when there's leadership and when there's this opportunity for shared learning across the landscape. So this brings me to our toolkit. As I said earlier, we're already seeing more landscape change, and so it's worth being intentional about what we do in response. It's the other side of the coin from things like forest restoration, and it's important to find space to grapple with and cope with the altered sense of place and the uncertainty that can come about what's next. So inevitability of loss is part of this conversation, but I think it's important to know the tools that we have to face change. And if we think broadly, there are a lot of them, both social and ecological, scientific and artistic, formal collaboratives and informal community-based networks. And those can be used to restore ecosystem services and important land uses, as well as to adapt to new norms. So I'll leave you with just a couple more quotes from participants in the East Jemez Landscape Futures process that I think sets the tone for this landscape and beyond. This requires some bravery. We need to expect that mistakes are going to be made. There is really no harm in trying. And if we're managing with uncertainty and we're all comparing notes, then at least we can share information and have a sounding board. So I'm happy to take any questions. And again, thanks to my collaborators in this work, to all the participants in both projects who took the time to share perspectives with us and their knowledge and experience, and to our partners and our funders.
We have a couple minutes for questions.
Thanks.
So I was kind of inspired by the silly quote, the emotional quote about, well, if we can't have pines, can we turn the oaks into trees? And I'm wondering to what extent this idea of adaptation has come up and actually been able to find useful ecosystem services in these transformative landscapes.
So useful ecosystem services in these transformed landscapes. So I think that's a really ripe area for research, and I don't know a lot that's going on. I do know that when people talk about like these oak shrublands, for example, there are some wildlife benefits for sure, and there can be opportunities for hunting. There can be different recreation opportunities, so I guess there's sort of the emotional ecosystem services piece. What is our sense of place? And then there's sort of what are the services that are being provided from sort of an intact ecosystem perspective or from a novel ecosystem perspective. And yeah, I'd say that's a pretty untapped area that's really ripe. Any grad students in the room?
Right, thank you.
Oh, was that a question?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you.